In the harsh fluorescent glow of Manila's airport terminal, 60-year-old literature teacher Amelia Santos sits alone on a plastic chair, her boarding pass for a collapsed airline crumpled in her weathered hands. For 30 years, she had sent countless students into the world with words of encouragement and hope. Now, abandoned by family who promised to help and facing the reality of her own broken dreams, she finds herself stranded with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of regret. This isn't just another travel mishap. This is about how a grounded pilot with his own crushing burdens would offer her more than just a ride. He would give her wings she never knew she needed. When Rafael Ilagan approached her with his battered Cessna and desperate proposal, neither of them realized they were about to embark on a journey that would transform not just their lives, but an entire community. But can two broken souls really build something beautiful together when everything they've ever known has fallen apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn leather satchel at Amelia Santos's feet had traveled with her through 3 decades of teaching, its brass buckles polished smooth by countless hands. Inside, carefully preserved between manila folders, lay hundreds of letters from former students' wedding invitations, graduation announcements, thank you notes written in careful script from children who had grown into doctors, teachers, and parents themselves. The satchel was her treasure chest, proof that her quiet life in the modest classroom at San Miguel Elementary had mattered. But tonight, under the unforgiving terminal lights, even those cherished memories felt distant. Mel adjusted her reading glasses and pulled out her phone again, scrolling through the same 3 contacts she'd been calling for the past 4 hours. Her nephew Carlo, who had promised to pick her up, no matter what happened. Her sister-in-law Maria, who had sworn she'd be there in an emergency. Her old friend Elena, who lived only 20 minutes from the airport. All 3 calls went straight to voicemail. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 30 years, she had been the one parents called when their children needed extra help, the teacher who stayed late to tutor struggling students, the woman who organized fundraisers for families in crisis. Now, when she needed help herself, the silence was deafening. The airline collapse had been sudden and brutal. Skyline Pacific, the budget carrier she'd chosen to save money for her long-delayed trip to Singapore, had simply vanished overnight. One moment she was boarding her flight. The next, she was watching uniformed officials tape yellow barriers across the departure gate. The airline's representatives had disappeared as quickly as their flights, leaving behind only a recorded message about seeking alternative arrangements. Mel's trip to Singapore had been 15 years in the making. Her sister Rosa lived there now, married to a successful businessman, living in a high-rise apartment with a view of the Marina Bay. They hadn't spoken in person since their mother's funeral, hadn't shared more than perfunctory birthday cards and Christmas greetings. But something about turning 60 had made Mel realize that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The last real conversation they'd had was during their mother's final days, when Rosa had accused Mel of being selfish for not encouraging their mother to move to Singapore for better medical care. Mel had fired back that not everyone could abandon their responsibilities to chase money and status. The words had hung between them like a blade, cutting through years of sisterly affection with surgical precision. Now, watching other stranded passengers argue with their families over phone calls, Mel wondered if she had been wrong. Maybe Rosa's offers to pay for visits hadn't been about showing off her wealth. Maybe they had been genuine attempts to bridge the gap that had grown between them over the years. She pulled out the boarding pass again, smoothing the crumpled paper against her knee. The flight had been scheduled to depart at 11:30 p.m., a red-eye that would have put her in Singapore by dawn. She had planned to surprise Rosa at her apartment to see if 15 years of silence could be healed with a simple conversation over coffee. Instead, she was surrounded by chaos. Families with small children had claimed the carpeted areas near the windows, spreading blankets and pillows in makeshift camps. Business travelers paced the concourse, their phone conversations growing increasingly heated as they tried to explain to colleagues why they wouldn't make their Monday morning meetings. Elderly couples sat in uncomfortable silence, their vacation plans crumbling around them. The airport's customer service desk had been overwhelmed since the announcement. A single harried employee, barely out of college, tried to field questions from hundreds of passengers with nothing but a phone number that no one answered and a promise that corporate is working on a solution. Mel found herself drawn to the families with children. A young mother near the departure gate was trying to keep her toddler calm while her husband argued loudly with someone on the phone. The child, no more than 3 years old, had begun to cry, not the dramatic wailing of a tantrum, but the quiet, hiccuping sobs of genuine distress. Without thinking, Mel approached them. "Would you like me to watch her for a moment while you make your calls?" she asked the mother. "I'm a teacher. I have experience with little ones." The woman looked at her with exhausted gratitude. "Are you sure? She's been so upset." "Of course." Mel settled herself cross-legged on the floor, something she hadn't done in years. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," the little girl whispered, her thumb finding its way to her mouth. "That's a beautiful name. My name is Miss Mel. Would you like to hear a story about a little girl named Emma who went on a great adventure?" As Mel began to weave a tale about brave Emma and her magical airplane, other children began to gather around. Their parents watched with relief as their anxious youngsters settled into the familiar rhythm of story time. Soon, Mel had an audience of a dozen children, their faces turned toward her with rapt attention. It was then that she first noticed him. Rafael Ilagan stood near the courier service desk, a clipboard in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. He was younger than her, perhaps in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His uniform shirt bore the logo of a cargo company she didn't recognize, and his boots were scuffed from long hours on tarmacs and loading docks. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They held the same weary kindness she'd seen in her own mirror after difficult days in the classroom, the look of someone who had learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply show up and try to help. He was watching her story circle with what looked like professional interest, the way another educator might observe a colleague's teaching technique. When one of the children laughed at her impression of a grumpy airport security guard, she caught him smiling. Raf had been working the late shift for Air Cargo Express for the past 6 months, ever since the regional airline where he'd been a pilot had folded. The pay was a fraction of what he'd earned in the cockpit, but it was steady work, and steady work was what he needed now. His son, Miguel's cochlear implant surgery had been successful, but the medical bills continued to arrive monthly, like unwelcome reminders of how precarious their situation had become. He'd been a pilot for 15 years, working his way up from small charter flights to regional carriers. The work had been demanding but rewarding, especially in the years after his wife Elena's death, when flying had become his escape from grief. But the airline industry in the Philippines was brutal, with companies appearing and disappearing like tropical storms. When Pacific Air had gone bankrupt, he'd found himself grounded not by lack of skill, but by economic forces beyond his control. The courier job paid enough to cover rent and Miguel's school fees, but it left little room for dreams. The aviation school he'd planned to start, a place where deaf students could learn to be mechanics and where kids from poor families could train to be pilots, remained a folder full of business plans and architectural sketches hidden in Brabant, his bedroom closet. Tonight, as he watched the teacher calm a crowd of frightened children with nothing but her voice and imagination, he found himself thinking about those plans again. There was something about her natural ability to bring order to chaos that reminded him of the best flight instructors he'd known, people who could make the impossible seem routine through patience and skill. When the airport's PA system crackled to life just after 2 a.m., the terminal fell silent. Even the children stopped their quiet chatter to listen. "Attention passengers of flight 447 to Singapore," the voice announced with bureaucratic flatness. "Due to the bankruptcy of Skyline Pacific Airways, replacement flights will not be available for a minimum of 7 to 10 days. Passengers are advised to make alternative arrangements or seek refunds through the Civil Aviation Authority. The airport terminal will remain open, but overnight accommodations are not available. The silence that followed was broken by a sound that tore at Mel's heart, the collective sigh of hundreds of people watching their plans crumble. Some passengers began to cry. Others started making urgent phone calls. A few simply gathered their belongings and walked toward the exit, their shoulders bent with defeat. But Mel looked around at the children who had been listening to her stories, at the families who had nowhere else to go, at the elderly couples who couldn't afford to book new flights on short notice. She thought about Rosa, probably already preparing for her arrival, and about the years of silence that had stretched between them. Then she did what she had always done when faced with a crisis. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. "Well," she said to the children still gathered around her, "it looks like we're going to be here for a while. Who wants to learn how to make the best paper airplane in the world?" As she reached for the stack of airline brochures on a nearby table, she noticed the pilot. She was sure that's what he was, despite his courier uniform watching her with something that looked like admiration. When their eyes met across the terminal, he raised his coffee cup in a small salute. She had no idea that this simple gesture would change everything. The paper airplane contest began as a distraction but quickly became something more profound. Mel had gathered discarded airline brochures, safety cards, and even a few newspapers, showing the children how to fold precise creases that would catch the air just right. Within an hour, the terminal floor was dotted with colorful aircraft made from recycled dreams. "The secret," she explained to 8-year-old Maria, whose parents were arguing in hushed Spanish near the departure board, "is in the balance. See how we fold the wings? They need to be exactly even, or the plane will spin instead of glide." The little girl nodded solemnly, her tongue poking out in concentration as she smoothed the creases. When she launched her Creaciones sleek fighter jet, made from a Singapore Airlines magazine, it soared 15 feet before landing gracefully near the abandoned check-in counter. "Miss Mel!" shouted Tommy, a freckled boy whose grandparents had been planning their first international trip. "Watch mine!" His paper plane, decorated with crayon drawings of clouds, performed a perfect loop before settling near the coffee shop. Other passengers began to take notice. A businessman in a wrinkled suit stopped his phone, pacing to watch. A young couple shared a smile as they helped their baby clap at the flying display. Even the harried airport employee behind the information desk looked up from her endless stack of complaint forms to watch the impromptu air show. Mel felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of teaching when learning came naturally, when the lesson emerged from necessity rather than curriculum. These children weren't worried about grades or test scores. They were simply learning to find wonder in the midst of disappointment. Rafael had finished his cargo manifest an hour ago, but instead of heading home to his small apartment, where Miguel was sleeping peacefully under the care of his neighbor, Mrs. Santos, he found himself lingering near the departure gates. Officially, he was waiting for a delayed shipment from Cebu. Unofficially, he was watching a master-teacher work. The woman Mel, he'd heard the children call her, moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had spent decades managing controlled chaos. She wasn't just keeping the kids busy, she was building community. Parents who had been strangers an hour ago were now sharing snacks and phone chargers. Elderly passengers had been drawn into the activity, offering advice on paper folding techniques they remembered from their own childhoods. When a security guard approached the group with what looked like an intention to disperse them, Mel intercepted him with a warm smile and a few quiet words. Within minutes, the guard was helping a shy little boy launch his first successful flight. "Excuse me," a voice said behind Raf. He turned to see a woman in her 40s, expensive handbag clutched tightly, her face drawn with exhaustion. "That teacher over there, do you know her? My daughter hasn't stopped crying since we got stranded, but she's been calm for the past hour watching those paper planes." Raf shook his head. "I don't know her personally, but she seems to have a gift." "She does." The woman paused, studying Mel's patient interaction with the children. "I'm Dr. Patricia Reyes. I'm a child psychologist, And I can tell you that what she's doing, creating normalcy and joy in the middle of chaos, that's not something you can teach in school. That's instinct. As if summoned by their conversation, the PA system crackled to life again. This time, the announcement hit the crowd like a physical blow. "Attention, stranded passengers," the mechanical voice intoned. "Airport management regrets to inform you that no replacement flights will be available for a minimum of 7 days. International carriers are unable to accommodate the volume of displaced passengers on short notice. Refund procedures will begin next week through the Civil Aviation Authority. We apologize for the inconvenience." The terminal erupted. Voices rose in a dozen languages as people called airlines, hotels, and family members. Someone near the baggage claim started shouting about lawyers and lawsuits. A woman collapsed into a plastic chair, sobbing openly as her teenage children tried to comfort her. The children in Mel's paper airplane circle looked around with wide, frightened eyes as the adult world dissolved into panic around them. Little Maria tugged on Mel's sleeve. "Miss Mel, are we going to be okay?" The question cut through the noise like a bell. Every adult conversation in the nearby area paused as parents and grandparents waited to hear how this stranger would answer their children's fears. Mel knelt down so she was at eye level with Maria, her voice carrying just far enough for the worried families to hear. "You know what, sweetheart? Sometimes the most beautiful journeys are the ones we never planned. Sometimes getting lost is how we find exactly where we're supposed to be." She stood and addressed the growing circle of families around her. "I know this is scary. I know you all had plans, places you needed to be, people waiting for you. But right now, we're all here together, and that means we can take care of each other." An elderly man with a walking cane spoke up. "But 7 days? I can't afford a hotel for 7 days. We spent everything on this trip for our 50th anniversary. Then we'll figure it out together," Mel said simply. "We'll share resources, look out for each other's children, make sure everyone has what they need. That's what people do in a crisis, they help each other." Dr. Reyes stepped forward. "She's right. I have connections with family services in the city. We can organize temporary accommodations for families with children." A businessman who had been complaining loudly into his phone suddenly looked up. "I can help with transportation. My company has vehicles." "I'm a nurse," said a woman near the coffee shop. "If anyone needs medical attention." What had started as panic was transforming into something else, entirely a community, born of necessity but strengthened by choice. Mel watched it happen with the satisfaction of a teacher who had just watched her students discover they could solve a problem they thought was impossible. That's when Rafael made his decision. He walked over to where Mel was organizing the volunteer efforts, her worn leather satchel now serving as a makeshift desk for lists of passenger names and needs. She looked up as he approached, and he found himself momentarily caught by the kindness in her brown eyes. "Miss Mel," he extended his hand. "I'm Rafael Ilagan. I couldn't help but notice what you've done here, bringing everyone together like this." She shook his hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to dealing with parents and administrators. "Amelia Santos, but everyone calls me Mel, and you're the pilot, aren't you? I saw you watching from over by the cargo desk." He was surprised she'd noticed him. "Former pilot, current cargo handler, but yes, I still fly when I can." He paused, aware that what he was about to say would sound crazy. "I have a proposition for you." "Oh?" "I fly cargo runs in a small plania, Cessna 172. Nothing fancy, but she's reliable. I could take you partway to Singapore, maybe as far as southern Malaysia. It would save you most of the trip, and you could catch a commercial flight from there." Mel stared at him for a long moment. Around them, the newly formed community continued to organize itself, families sharing contact information, resources being allocated, children playing with their paper airplanes, while adults planned for an unexpected week together. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. Rafael looked around at the organized chaos she had created, at the families who had gone from despair to hope in the space of an hour, at the children whose fear had been transformed into excitement by paper airplanes and stories. Because, he said, you just did something I've been trying to figure out how to do for years. You built something beautiful out of nothing but goodwill and determination. Maybe it's time I learned how to do the same. Mel fingered one of the paper airplanes that had landed near her feet, a delicate creation, made from a boarding pass, its wings carefully balanced, ready to fly toward an unknown destination. Tell me about your plane, she said. As Rafael began to describe his Cessna and the route they could take, neither of them noticed the crowd of families gathering around to listen. The paper airplane in Mel's hand caught a breeze from the air conditioning and lifted gently into the air, spinning once before settling on the floor like a promise waiting to be kept. The sunrise over Manila painted the sky in shades of coral and gold as Rafael led Mel through the narrow streets of Tondo, where his small apartment occupied the second floor of a weathered concrete building. The scent of frying garlic and coffee drifted from windows as the neighborhood stirred to life, vendors setting up their stalls and children in school uniforms hurrying past with backpacks bouncing. Miguel's probably awake by now, Raf said, taking the stairs two at a time. He's an early riser, just like his mother was. Mel followed more slowly, her leather satchel heavy on her shoulder and her body stiff from the uncomfortable night in the airport. She had agreed to Raf's proposal in the early hours of the morning, after they had spent hours talking through the logistics and the risks. The plan was ambitious but simple. They would island, hop across the archipelago in his Cessna, refueling at small airstrips, until they reached the southern islands where she could catch a commercial flight to Singapore. The cost would be minimal compared to booking a new international ticket, just fuel money and basic accommodations. More importantly, it felt like an adventure, something she had promised herself she would embrace at this stage of her life. The apartment door opened before Raf could reach for his keys, revealing a boy of about 10, with his father's dark eyes and a bright, mischievous smile. His hearing aids were already in place, and he moved with the confident ease of a child who had learned to navigate the world on his own terms. "Papa!" Miguel's hands moved in rapid sign language, his excitement evident even to Mel, who didn't understand the gestures. "English, Miguel," Raf said gently, speaking aloud while signing. "We have a guest. This is Miss Mel, the teacher I told you about." Miguel studied Mel with the frank curiosity of childhood, then extended his hand with careful formality. "Nice to meet you, Miss Mel. Papa says you're going on an adventure." "That's right," Mel said, accepting his handshake. "Your father is going to teach me about flying." "He's the best pilot in the Philippines," Miguel declared with absolute confidence. "He taught me how to read clouds and wind patterns. Want to see my drawings?" Before Mel could answer, Miguel had darted to a small table by the window where papers were scattered in careful disorder. He returned with a crayon drawing that showed a small airplane soaring over green islands, with stick figures waving from the cockpit. "This is Papa's plane," Miguel explained. "And this is where we're going to build the flying school when we save enough money." Mel studied the drawing more carefully. The detail was remarkable for a 10-year-old. The proportions of the aircraft were accurate. The landscape below showed careful attention to the geography of the islands, and there was something hopeful in the bright colors that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "You've captured the spirit of flying," she told him seriously. "I've never been in a small plane before, but looking at your drawing, I think I understand why your father loves it." Miguel beamed and immediately began pulling out more drawings, detailed sketches of aircraft instruments, maps of flight routes, and architectural plans for hangars and classrooms that showed a sophisticated understanding of his father's dreams. "He helps me with the technical parts," Raf explained, watching his son with obvious pride. "But the vision, that's all Miguel. He wants to be an aviation mechanic when he grows up. The flying school will hire deaf mechanics," Miguel said matter-of-factly. "Papa says there's no reason we can't fix planes just because we can't hear them. We can feel vibrations and see problems that hearing people miss." Mel felt a familiar warmth, the recognition of a bright mind that had been encouraged to think beyond limitations. "That's brilliant. Some of my best students were the ones who learned to see the world differently." As Raf prepared coffee and simple breakfast, Mel found herself drawn into conversation with Miguel about his school, his friends, and his understanding of his father's work. The boy signed occasionally when he was excited, his hands moving in graceful patterns that reminded her of the paper airplanes from the night before, precise, purposeful, beautiful in their economy of motion. "Papa showed me the business plan for the school," Miguel said, pulling a worn folder from beneath a stack of textbooks. "Want to see?" The folder was thick, with papers detailed financial projections, architectural sketches, correspondence with potential instructors and donors. Some of the documents were years old, their edges soft with handling. Others were more recent, with updated cost estimates and revised timelines that showed Raf had never stopped refining his vision. "This is impressive," Mel said, flipping through pages of carefully researched curriculum plans and facility requirements. "How long have you been working on this?" "Since before Elena died," Raf said quietly, returning with coffee in mismatched mugs. "It was her idea, actually. She worked with deaf children at a special school in Quezon City. She saw how few opportunities they had for technical training, especially in fields like aviation maintenance." Miguel nodded solemnly. "Mama said that just because people can't hear doesn't mean they can't build things that fly." The weight of dreams deferred hung heavy in the small apartment. Mel could see it in the careful way Raf handled the folder, in the mixture of hope and resignation in his voice when he talked about the school. She understood that feeling, the gradual acceptance that some dreams might always remain just out of reach. "What would it take to get started?" she asked. "Realistically, I mean." Raf sat down across from her, Miguel settling beside him with the easy affection of a child who was accustomed to being included in adult conversations. "About 2 million pesos for the initial setup," he said. "Hangar space, basic aircraft for training, classroom facilities, insurance. We'd start small, maybe 10 students in the first class, but even that feels impossible now, with Miguel's medical expenses and—" "Papa," Miguel interrupted gently. "Tell her about the good parts." Raf smiled, his expression softening. "The good parts are that we already have interest from students, some potential instructors, and a few sponsors who have promised equipment donations. Mrs. Santos next door, she's a retired engineer, has offered to help with the technical curriculum. There's a community here that wants this to succeed." Mel thought about her pension account, about the years she had saved carefully for a retirement that suddenly seemed less important than the dreams sitting in front of her. She thought about Rosa in Singapore, and about the distance between them that had nothing to do with geography. "How much would it cost for you to fly me to Singapore?" she asked. "Fuel and basic expenses, maybe 30,000 pesos. But Mel, you don't have to." "I'm not talking about charity," she said firmly. "I'm talking about a fair exchange. You teach me about flying, help me reach my sister, and in return—" Miguel's eyes widened as he understood where she was heading. "You want to help with the school?" "I want to learn about it," Mel corrected. "I want to understand what you're building here. And if I like what I see—" She looked around the small apartment, at the drawings taped to the walls, at the business plan that represented years of careful dreaming. "Well, I've spent 30 years teaching children to reach for impossible things. Maybe it's time I learned to reach for a few myself." Father and son exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation in sign language. Then Miguel grinned and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "I'm going to draw you in the airplane," he announced. "Flying with Papa to see your sister, and then flying back to help us build the school." As Mel watched the boy begin to sketch, she realized that somewhere in the space of a single morning, her journey had become about more than reaching Singapore. It had become about discovering what was possible when you stopped planning and started trusting the wind to carry you toward something unexpected. The morning air at Ninoy Aquino's General Aviation Terminal carried the familiar scent of jet fuel and possibility. Mel stood beside Rafael's Cessna 172, her hands pressed against the warm metal of the wing strut as he conducted his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone for whom safety was second nature. "She's 23 years old," Raf explained, running his fingers along the leading edge of the wing, checking for any nicks or damage. Not the newest plane in the sky, but she's been well maintained. I've put a lot of hours on her doing cargo runs, and she's never let me down. The aircraft was painted white with blue trim, showing the gentle wear of years spent in service, but maintained with obvious care. Inside the cockpit, Mel could see instruments that looked both simpler and more complex than she had expected: analog gauges with needles and numbers that would tell them everything they needed to know about altitude, speed, and direction. "Are you nervous?" Raf asked, noticing her studying the plane with wide eyes. "Terrified," Mel admitted with a laugh, "but in a good way. I haven't felt this kind of anticipation since my first day of teaching." They had spent the previous hour at Miguel's school, where Raf had explained their journey to Mrs. Santos, the neighbor who would care for Miguel while they were gone. The goodbye had been difficult but not dramatic. Miguel was accustomed to his father's unpredictable work schedule, and his excitement about the potential aviation school had made their departure feel more like the beginning of an adventure than a separation. "First thing we need to do is get you familiar with the basics," Raf said, opening the pilot side door and gesturing for her to climb in. "You'll be sitting in the left seat. That's where the pilot in command sits. Don't worry, I'll be flying today, but I want you to get comfortable with the controls." Mel settled into the worn leather seat, her hands instinctively finding the yoke, the steering wheel-like control that would direct the aircraft through the sky. The cockpit was smaller than she had expected, with barely enough room for 2 people, but there was something intimate and purposeful about the close quarters. "These are the primary flight instruments," Raf explained, pointing to the panel in front of her. "Airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, altimeter, turn coordinator, heading indicator, and vertical speed indicator. We call them the 6-pack, and they'll tell us everything we need to know about how the airplane is flying." As he explained each instrument, Mel found herself thinking about her classroom, about the way she had learned to read the subtle signs that told her whether her students were understanding a lesson or struggling with confusion. Flying, she realized, would require the same kind of attention to multiple sources of information, the same ability to process complex data and make quick decisions. "The weather report shows clear skies for our first leg," Raf continued, spreading a sectional chart across their knees. "We'll fly south to Batangas, then Island, hop through the Visayas. Tonight we'll stop in Dumaguete. There's a small airstrip there, and I know a family who runs a guest house." The chart showed their route as a series of lines and symbols that looked like a foreign language, but Raf patiently explained the navigation aids, airports, and landmarks they would use to find their way. Mel was struck by how much trust was required. Trust in the instruments, trust in the weather reports, trust in the skills of the pilot, and ultimately, trust in the aircraft itself. "Ready?" Raf asked, settling into the right seat and beginning his own checklist. "As ready as I'll ever be," Mel replied. The engine start was surprisingly smoother, brief vibration through the airframe, then the steady rumble of the Continental engine settling into its rhythm. Raf contacted the control tower, his voice professional and calm, as he requested permission to taxi to the runway. As they rolled slowly through the maze of taxiways, Mel watched other aircraft-sleek business jets, vintage trainers, and modern cargo planes preparing for their own journeys. She thought about all the times she had looked up at aircraft passing overhead, never imagining that she might someday be sitting in one herself, about to embark on an adventure that would have seemed impossible just days ago. "Tower Cessna 4728R ready for departure," Raf radioed as they reached the end of the runway. "Cessna 28R, cleared for takeoff, runway 6. Contact departure on 119.4. Cleared for takeoff, Cessna 28R. Raf looked over at Mel with a grin. "Here we go." He pushed the throttle forward, and the engine's note rose to an urgent crescendo. The airplane began to roll, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the runway markings blurred past the windows. Mel gripped the sides of her seat, her heart pounding as the ground rushed by faster than she had ever experienced. Then, with surprising gentleness, The rumbling stopped. The nose lifted slightly, and suddenly they were airborne, the ground falling away beneath them as Manila spread out like a detailed map. "Oh my," Mel whispered, pressing her face to the window. The city stretched endlessly in all directions, a patchwork of neighborhoods, highways, and waterways that she had never seen from this perspective. The traffic that had seemed so chaotic from ground level now appeared organized and purposeful, streams of light flowing through well-planned channels. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Raf said, his voice warm with shared appreciation. "I had no idea," Mel replied. "I mean, I knew the city was large, but seeing it like this, it's like viewing the world from God's perspective." As they climbed higher, the individual buildings gave way to districts, then to regions, and finally to the great blue expanse of Manila Bay. Fishing boats dotted the water like scattered rice grains, their wakes forming delicate V patterns that spread and faded in the morning sun. "The controls are yours," Raf said suddenly. "What?" Mel's hands flew away from the yoke as if it had caught fire. "Just for a moment. Feel how the airplane responds to gentle pressure. Don't fight it, think of it like guiding rather than forcing." With trembling hands, Mel took hold of the yoke again. The airplane seemed alive beneath her touch, responding to the slightest input with graceful adjustments to its flight path. When she pressed gently to the right, the aircraft banked smoothly in that direction. When she pulled back slightly, the nose lifted, and they climbed. "That's it," Raf encouraged. "You're flying." The realization hit her with unexpected force. She was actually flying an airplane, controlling a machine that was carrying them through the sky at 120 miles per hour, 3,000 feet above the earth. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life with her feet firmly planted in classroom floors, the sensation was revelatory. "I'm flying," she said aloud, testing the words. "Yes, you are." Below them, the coastline of Luzon began to give way to open water, and ahead, the green islands of the central Philippines rose from the sea like emeralds scattered on blue silk. Their journey had truly begun, and with each passing minute, Mel felt herself becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. The emergency landing in Panglao Island had not been part of their plan, but as Mel sat on the beach, watching local mechanics examine Rafael's Cessna, she found herself grateful for the unexpected detour. The fuel pump had developed a leak somewhere over the Bohol Sea, forcing them to land at the island's small airstrip instead of continuing to their planned stop in Dumaguete. "It'll take at least 2 days to get the part," Raf said, settling beside her on the warm sand. "Maybe 3. I'm sorry, Mel. This isn't the efficient journey I promised you." "Stop apologizing," she said, pulling a bundle of letters from her worn leather satchel. "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones that force you to slow down and notice where you are." The letters were from Rosa, carefully preserved in chronological order, spanning the 15 years since their mother's funeral. Mel had carried them with her, reading and rereading them during the long night at the airport, trying to understand where their relationship had gone wrong. "My sister," she explained, noticing Raf's curious glance at the familiar handwriting on the envelopes. "We haven't spoken properly in years, but she kept writing. I kept her letters, but I never really responded to them." The earliest letters were formal, almost business-like updates about Rosa's new life in Singapore, her husband's work, their travels. But as Mel read them now, with the perspective of distance and the clarity that comes from examining old wounds, she could see the loneliness between the lines. "Listen to this," she said, unfolding a letter dated 3 years after their mother's death. She writes, "The city is beautiful, Mel, but sometimes I miss the way the rain sounded on our old roof in Quezon City. Do you remember how we used to count the seconds between thunder and lightning? Marcus thinks I'm silly for missing such things, but I think he never learned to find poetry in storms." Raf listened thoughtfully as she read, his eyes on the horizon where fishing boats were returning with the day's catch. "Sounds like she was trying to bridge the gap between you." "She was," Mel admitted, "and I was too proud to see it. She'd write about missing our mother's cooking, or ask if I remembered some family story, and I'd interpret it as her showing off about her new life. I thought she was being condescending. She pulled out another letter, this one from 5 years ago. Harishi says, I've been thinking about starting a foundation for education initiatives in Southeast Asia. I keep remembering how you used to say that every child deserves a teacher who believes in them. Would you consider consulting on the curriculum development? I could arrange for you to visit, maybe spend a few months here working with me. And you said no? I never responded at all. Mel's voice carried the weight of regret. I was convinced she was trying to fix my life because she thought it wasn't good enough. It never occurred to me that she might actually want my expertise, that she might miss having her sister as a partner in something meaningful. The mechanics had finished their examination and were walking toward them, wiping their hands on oil-stained rags. The older man, introduced earlier as Captain Rudy, had been flying in and out of island airstrips for 30 years. Good news and bad news, he said with a grin. Good news is the pump can be fixed. Bad news is we need to order a seal from Manila, and with the shipping delays from the airline situation, it'll be Thursday before we can get her airworthy again. Thursday, Mel repeated. That's 4 days. I know it's frustrating, Raf began, but she held up a hand. Actually, I think it might be perfect timing. She looked around at the pristine beach, the crystal-clear water, the small fishing village where children were already gathering to stare at the unexpected visitors. When's the last time you took a real break, Rafael? Not working cargo runs or worrying about Miguel's medical bills, but actually resting. He considered this. Honestly, probably not since Elena died. There's always been something urgent, some bill to pay or problem to solve. Then we'll make the best of it. And meanwhile, she held up Rosa's letters. I think it's time I finally responded to my sister properly. That evening, they found themselves in the village's small internet cafe, a ramshackle building with a half-dozen computers and a satellite connection that worked when the weather was clear. Mel sat in front of a screen, staring at a blank email, while Raf used another computer to video call Miguel. Papa! Miguel's excited face filled the screen. Mrs. Santos taught me how to make adobo. And guess what? There was a man here today asking about flying lessons. Mrs. Santos gave him your phone number. Really? What kind of lessons? He has a deaf nephew who wants to learn aircraft maintenance. Mrs. Santos told him about our school plans, and he said he knows other families who would be interested. Raf felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the mixture of hope and fear that came whenever someone showed genuine interest in his dreams. Did he leave his contact information? Mrs. Santos has it. She said to tell you that the community is more ready for this than you think. After the call ended, Raf sat staring at the blank screen, processing this unexpected development. For years, he had imagined his aviation school as a distant goal, something that might happen someday if circumstances aligned perfectly. The idea that people were actively seeking out what he wanted to offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Any luck with your email? He asked Mel. She gestured at her own blank screen. I've started and deleted about 20 different versions. How do you apologize for 15 years of stubborn silence? How do you explain that you finally understand what someone was trying to give you? Maybe you start small, Raf suggested. Tell her where you are, what you're doing. Sometimes the gesture matters more than the words. Mel nodded and began to type. Rosa. I'm writing this from an internet cafe on Panglao Island, where I'm stranded with a broken airplane and a pilot who's teaching me about second chances. I know this might sound crazy, but I'm finally on my way to see you. It's taken me 15 years to realize that when you wrote about missing home, you weren't showing off your new life, you were inviting me to be part of it. I've been reading your old letters, and I can see now how many times you reached out, how many times you asked for my help with your foundation work, how many times you simply wanted to talk to your sister. I'm sorry I was too proud to hear what you were really saying. I don't know exactly when I'll reach Singapore. Traveling companion says, the best journeys are the ones that teach you something unexpected, but I wanted you to know that I'm coming. And I wanted to ask if that foundation work is still something you're interested in pursuing. Because it turns out I've met someone with an aviation school dream that might align perfectly with education initiatives in Southeast Asia. I miss you, Rosa. I miss having a sister. Love, Mel. She read the message over twice before hitting send, then sat back in her chair with a mixture of relief and anxiety. That was brave, Raf said. Terrifying, she corrected, but necessary. Some bridges can only be rebuilt by admitting they were broken in the first place. As they walked back to the small guest house where they would spend the next few days, Mel found herself thinking about the unexpected connections forming around their journey, Miguel's enthusiasm, the stranger inquiring about flying lessons, Rosa's years of patient invitation, and her own growing investment in Raf's dreams. Sometimes, she thought, the airplane breaking down wasn't a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to discover what you'd been flying toward all along. The storm arrived on their third day in Panglao, bringing with it sheets of rain that turned the dirt roads to mud and sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Mel and Rafael found themselves stranded in the village's small community center, along with 30 local children whose school had been cancelled due to the weather. "Miss Teacher," called 8-year-old Anna, the daughter of the mechanic working on their plane, "can you tell us about airplanes?" What had started as a simple request for a story had evolved into an impromptu English lesson, with Mel using aviation terms to teach vocabulary while the children drew pictures of aircraft and practiced pronunciation. By midday, she had a classroom full of eager students who were learning to count altitudes, describe weather patterns, and dream about flying to distant places. In English, we say the airplane climbs, Mel demonstrated, using her hands to show the motion. "Can everyone try? The airplane climbs." "The airplane climbs," the children chorused, their voices filled with excitement. Rafael watched from the corner of the room, officially helping with mechanical terms, but actually marveling at Mel's natural ability to turn any situation into a learning opportunity. She had somehow managed to create structure and joy out of a weather delay, transforming a room full of restless children into engaged students. "Mr. Pilot," Anna said, turning to Rafael, "can you teach us about instruments?" "Well," Rafael said, moving to join Mel at the front of the room, "instruments are how pilots know where they are and where they're going, even when they can't see outside." He began drawing simple diagrams on the chalkboard circles and lines that represented the basic flight instruments he had shown Mel just days earlier. But as he explained each one, he found himself thinking about Miguel, about the aviation school, about all the children who might never have the opportunity to learn these concepts simply because of where they were born or what challenges they faced. "This is the altimeter," he said, drawing a clock-like face with a pointer. "It tells us how high we are above the sea. Who can guess why that's important?" A boy near the back raised his hand eagerly. "So you don't hit the mountains." "Exactly. And this instrument," Raf drew another circle with a horizontal line through it, "tells us if the airplane is flying level or if it's tilted to one side." As the lesson continued, he noticed something remarkable happening. The children weren't just learning about instruments, they were beginning to understand the logic behind flight itself. When he explained how the compass worked, they connected it to the way their fathers navigated fishing boats. When he described how airspeed was measured, they related it to the feeling of wind on their faces when they rode their bicycles. "You know," Mel said during a brief break while the children practiced drawing instruments, "this is exactly what you described in your business plan. Teaching aviation concepts to children who might never otherwise have access to this knowledge." Rafael looked around the room, at children whose families made their living from fishing and farming, who had probably never imagined they could understand something as complex as aircraft navigation. Yet here they were, eagerly absorbing concepts that many college students struggled with. "It's working," he said with wonder. "The methodology Elena and I developed actually works with any group of kids, not just the ones we originally planned to serve." "Of course it works. You're both natural teachers." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the community center, something extraordinary was taking shape. The village elder, Mang Thomas, had joined the group and was listening with obvious interest as Mel and Rafael alternated between English lessons and aviation instruction. "In my 67 years," Mang Thomas said during the lunch break, I have never seen children so excited about learning. Usually, when school is cancelled, they run wild. But you have given them something to think about, something to dream about. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a beautifully crafted compass, its brass surface polished to a warm glow. The needle moved freely within its housing, and around the edge, someone had carefully engraved the cardinal directions in both English and the local dialect. "This belonged to my grandfather," he explained, placing it gently in Mel's hands. He was a fisherman, but he understood that sometimes the best navigation comes not from instruments, but from knowing your destination in your heart. Mel examined the compass with reverence. The craftsmanship was exquisite, speaking to generations of careful maintenance and respect for the tool's importance. "I can't accept something so valuable." "You misunderstand," Mang Thomas said with a gentle smile. "This is not a gift for you to keep. This is a loan for your journey. When you reach your destination, your real destination, not just the place you thought you were going, you will know what to do with it." That afternoon, as the storm began to clear, Mel found herself sitting by the window, turning the compass over in her hands. The needle pointed steadily north, regardless of how she moved the instrument, always finding its true direction, despite any interference. "Penny for your thoughts," Rafael said, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee from the village's small cafe. "I was thinking about direction," she replied. "For 30 years I thought I knew exactly where my life was headed. Classroom, students, retirement, maybe some travel if I was careful with my savings. But this compass," she held it up to catch the light, "it finds north, no matter what storms are raging around it. And now I'm starting to think that maybe my real north isn't Singapore at all. Maybe it's not even about reaching a destination. Maybe it's about learning to navigate by something more reliable than just the plans I made when I was too young to know better." Rafael sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Miguel's latest drawing shows you teaching at the aviation school. Did I mention that?" He drew me teaching, in front of a classroom full of kids, with airplanes on the chalkboard behind you. When I asked him about it, he said, "Papa, Miss Mel understands how to make learning feel like an adventure." Through the window, they could see the children from their impromptu lesson playing in the clearing weather, their games now incorporating the aviation concepts they had learned. Some were pretending to be pilots, using sticks as control yokes and making engine noises as they flew around the muddy courtyard. Others had fashioned paper airplanes from notebook pages and were testing different designs. "You've changed something here," Mel observed. "In one afternoon, you've opened up a whole new world of possibilities for these kids." "We've changed something," Rafael corrected. "This only worked because you created the framework for learning. You made it safe for them to ask questions and make mistakes." As the sun broke through the clouds, painting the village in golden light, Mel felt the compass needle settle in her palm. She thought about Rosa, waiting in Singapore, and about the email response that had arrived that morning. An enthusiastic message full of excitement about their reunion and genuine interest in learning about the aviation school project. But she also thought about Miguel, drawing pictures of a future where she was part of his family's dreams. She thought about the children who had spent the afternoon discovering that they were capable of understanding complex concepts, and about the village elder who had trusted her with his grandfather's compass. "Rafael," she said quietly, "when we get the plane fixed, I want to make a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that might change both of our flight's plans." Outside, the children continued their aviation games, their laughter carrying on the clean air left behind by the storm. And in her hands, the compass needle held steady, pointing toward a destination she was only beginning to understand. The distress call came through on Rafael's emergency radio, just as they were preparing to depart Panglao on the 4th morning. The voice was tense, but controlled a pilot reporting a medical emergency aboard a small charter flight that had been forced to land on a remote strip in northern Palawan due to engine trouble. "Mayday, Mayday. This is charter flight Papa Kilo 739. We have a diabetic passenger in critical condition. Insulin supply exhausted. Request immediate medical assistance at Balabac Island airstrip." Rafael grabbed the radio microphone. Papa Kilo, 739. This is Cessna 4000, 728R. What is your passenger's condition? Unconscious for the past 20 minutes. Blood sugar critically low. We have no medical supplies aboard. Mel watched as Rafael's expression shifted from concern to grim determination. She had learned to read the subtle changes in his face over the past few days, the way his jaw tightened when he was calculating risks, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he was processing complex information quickly. "Where's Balabac Island?" she asked. 2 hours south of here, he replied, studying his charts. Remote fishing community. The nearest hospital would be in Puerto Princesa, but that's another hour and a half by air from there. The radio crackled again. Any aircraft in the vicinity? This is Papa Kilo, 739. Passenger is a 68-year-old male. His wife indicates he missed his morning insulin dose due to flight delays. She has an emergency kit, but it's in their checked luggage at Manila airport. Mel felt her chest tighten. The passenger could be any of the travelers they had left behind at the airport, any of the families who had trusted budget airlines with their carefully planned vacations. Can we help them? Rafael was already calculating flight times and fuel requirements. If we push hard, we could reach them in 90 minutes. But Mel, this is exactly the kind of flying that killed my wife. Emergency situations, marginal weather, pressure to take risks that normally I would never. What would Elena want you to do? The question stopped him cold. For a moment, the only sound was the static from the radio and the distant noise of mechanics preparing their Cessna for departure. She would already be in the airplane, he said quietly. They were airborne within 10 minutes, Rafael pushing the Cessna to its maximum cruise speed, while Mel worked the radio, coordinating with Coast Guard stations and medical facilities throughout the region. The morning sky was clear, but weather reports indicated that thunderstorms were building over Palawan, the kind of afternoon convection that could make flying treacherous. There, Rafael pointed toward a thin strip of concrete, barely visible among the green hills of the small island. That's Balabac. As they descended, Mel could see the stranded charter aircrafter twin-engine Piper that looked much newer and more sophisticated than their simple Cessna. Near the plane, a small group of people stood in the shade of the wing, one figure lying motionless on what appeared to be a makeshift stretcher. Rafael's landing was flawless, despite the crosswind and the narrow runway. They taxied quickly to where the charter flight was parked, and before the propeller had stopped turning, Mel was out of her seat and running toward the group. The passenger was indeed an older man, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin pale and clammy. His wife, a woman about Mel's age, knelt beside him with tears streaming down her face. "Help him," she pleaded. "Please, we were supposed to be celebrating our 40th anniversary. I can't lose him now." Mel knelt beside the woman, taking her hands. "What's his name?" "Roberto Mendoza. He's been diabetic for 20 years, but he's always been so careful with his medication. This morning everything went wrong, delayed flights, missed meals, and his insulin was in the luggage that never made it onto our plane." Rafael was talking urgently with the charter pilot, a young man who looked overwhelmed by the medical emergency. "How long has he been unconscious?" "Almost an hour now. We've tried everything we could think of, sugar, water, orange juice from our emergency supplies, but nothing's working." "We need to get him to a hospital," Rafael said. "The question is where?" The charter pilot shook his head. "My engines are showing temperature problems. That's why we landed here in the first place. I can't guarantee they'll get us to Puerto Princesa." "Then we'll take him," Mel said without hesitation. Rafael stared at her. "Mel, he needs medical equipment we don't have. If something happens during the flight, then we deal with it. But if we don't try, we know what happens." The decision crystallized the transformation that had been building in Mel over the past few days. The careful, risk-averse teacher who had spent her career following established procedures was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some situations demanded action, despite uncertainty. They transferred Roberto to the Cessna, his wife Elena riding in the back seat, while Mel took the co-pilot position. Rafael filed a flight plan directly to Puerto Princesa General Hospital, requesting emergency medical clearance and priority handling. The flight was a nightmare of turbulence and anxiety. Thunderstorms had developed faster than predicted, forcing them to navigate around towering cumulus clouds that reached above their aircraft's service ceiling. Roberto's condition fluctuated. Sometimes he would mumble incoherently, other times he would slip back into unconsciousness. "His breathing is getting worse," Elena called from the back seat. Mel unbuckled her harness and turned around, checking Roberto's pulse and trying to remember the basic first aid training she had received years ago. His heartbeat was rapid and irregular, his skin growing cooler by the minute. "How much longer?" she asked Rafael. 20 minutes if the weather holds, but there's a line of storms between us and Puerto Princesa. We might have to—" The airplane lurched violently as they hit turbulence, throwing Mel against the cabin wall. Outside, lightning flashed through the grey clouds, and rain began pelting the windscreen with increasing intensity. "Can you see the runway?" Mel asked as they descended through the storm. "Not yet. I'm flying on instruments." Rafael's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was managing the controls in the rough air. Then, suddenly, they broke through the clouds, and the lights of Puerto Princesa spread out below them like scattered jewels. The airport runway appeared ahead, its approach lights cutting through the rain like a beacon. The landing was rough but safe, and within minutes, Roberto was loaded into an ambulance, medical personnel working to stabilize his blood sugar as they raced toward the hospital. Elena rode with them, clutching Mel's hand until the ambulance doors closed. "Will he be okay?" Mel asked the paramedic. "You got him here in time, another hour, and—" he shrugged, "you saved his life." As they watched the ambulance disappear into the night, Mel felt something shift inside her chest. The careful boundaries she had maintained for 30 years, between helper and helped, between teacher and student, between safety and risk had dissolved completely. "That was incredible flying," she told Rafael, as they secured the aircraft for the night. "That was terrifying flying," he corrected. "Everything about that flight violated my personal safety protocols. But—" he paused, looking up at the clearing sky where stars were beginning to appear between the departing clouds. Elena would have been proud. They found a small hotel near the airport, too exhausted to do anything but collapse into their respective rooms. But before they separated, Mel pulled out Mang Tomas's compass and held it up to catch the light from the terminal. "It's pointing in a new direction," she said. "North is still north." "No," she said quietly. "I mean my north, the direction I'm supposed to be heading." She looked at him with eyes that held a new certainty. "Rafael, I don't think I'm going to Singapore." "What do you mean?" "I mean Roberto and Elena reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. Not to follow safe lesson plans or stick to approved curriculum, but to show up when people need help and figure out how to make a difference." She handed him the compass, watching as the needle found its bearing, despite the trembling in her hands. "Tomorrow, I want to call Rosa and ask her to come here instead. I want to show her the aviation school, introduce her to Miguel, let her see what we could build together if we combined her foundation resources with your dreams and my teaching experience." Rafael stared at the compass, then at her face, reading the determination there. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Some people spend their whole lives trying to find their purpose. I just found mine at 0 feet in a thunderstorm, watching you save a stranger's life, with nothing but skill and courage." The compass needle held steady between them, pointing toward a destination that neither of them had planned, but both were finally ready to pursue. The hospital called at dawn to report that Roberto Mendoza was stable, his blood sugar levels restored to normal, and that he was asking to speak with the angels who had saved his life. When Mel and Rafael arrived at his room, they found him sitting up in bed, holding his wife Elena's hand, both of them tearful with gratitude. 40 years of marriage," Roberto said, his voice still weak but his eyes bright. "And yesterday I almost missed our anniversary dinner because I was too stubborn to ask for help when I needed it. We know the feeling, Mel said gently. The doctor says you flew through a storm to get me here. In a small plane. He shook his head in wonder. I've been afraid to fly in anything smaller than a 747 my whole life, and you two probably saved me in something no bigger than my car. Elena Mendoza squeezed her husband's hand. We want to do something for you. Roberto owns a construction company in Manila. Whatever you're building, whatever you need. Actually, Mel said, exchanging a look with Rafael, there might be something. They spent the next hour describing the aviation school project, showing Roberto and Elena the business plan on Rafael's tablet, explaining the vision for training disadvantaged youth and deaf students in aircraft maintenance and pilot skills. The older couple listened with growing excitement. This is exactly what the Philippines needs, Roberto said. Practical education that leads to real jobs, opportunities for kids who usually get overlooked. He turned to his wife. Remember what we talked about doing with the company's foundation funds? Elena nodded eagerly. We've been looking for the right education project to support. This sounds perfect. By the time they left the hospital, they had tentative commitments for construction services, foundation funding, and a promise that Roberto would personally oversee the building of classroom and hangar facilities. But more than that, they had witnessed something that would change how Mel thought about their mission forever. Did you see the way his face lit up when you explained the program for deaf students? She asked Rafael as they walked back to their hotel. He understood immediately why it mattered. A lot of people don't. It's because he almost lost something precious yesterday, and we helped him keep it. Now he wants to be part of helping other people keep their dreams. The next phase of their journey took on new urgency. Instead of continuing towards Singapore, they were flying back to Manila with a purpose that felt completely different from the desperate escape that had begun their adventure. Mel had called Rosa the night before, their conversation lasting nearly 2 hours as she explained the change in plans. "You're sure about this, sis?" Rosa had asked. I'm thrilled that you want me to visit the Philippines instead, but this is a complete reversal of everything you've been planning." "Maybe," Mel had replied. "Or maybe this is what I was actually planning all along, and I just didn't know it yet." Rosa's laughter had carried across the phone line like music. "That sounds like something the old Mel would have said, the one who used to tell me we should always be ready for adventures we didn't see coming. I want you to meet Rafael and Miguel. I want you to see the village where we taught aviation lessons during a thunderstorm. I want to show you what it looks like when education becomes a bridge instead of a barrier. And I want to see this amazing pilot who taught my sister to fly." Now, as they prepared for the return flight to Manila, Mel found herself thinking about the complexity of the logistics they were about to undertake. Rafael had spent the morning on the phone with potential instructors, equipment suppliers, and government officials who could help navigate the certification requirements for starting an aviation school. "The good news," he reported over breakfast, "is that there's a lot of support for this kind of program. The Department of Education has been looking for innovative vocational training initiatives, and the aviation industry is desperate for qualified mechanics and pilots. And the challenging news? The challenging news is that we need to move fast. There's a window of opportunity right now, government incentives for technical education, private foundation, interest in inclusive programs, and a generation of young people who are eager for alternatives to traditional college tracks." Mel pulled out a small notebook where she had been sketching ideas for curriculum development. "I've been thinking about the structure. We could start with a summer program-intensive courses for high school graduates who want to explore aviation careers. Partner with local schools to offer after-school programs that introduce younger kids to basic concepts, like what we did in Panglao." "Exactly. Build interest early, then provide pathways for serious students to continue into professional training." Their conversation was interrupted by Rafael's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Miguel's school number, and when he answered, Mrs. Santos's excited voice filled the breakfast area. "Rafael, you need to come home immediately. There are people here, reporters, education officials, even someone from the airport authority. They all want to know about the aviation school. What are you talking about? The story about you and Miss Mel rescuing that man yesterday, it's in all the newspapers. And somehow they found out about your school plans. The reporters are asking Miguel about his drawings, and he's telling them all about learning to read clouds and wind patterns. Mel leaned closer to the phone. Mrs. Santos, this is Mel. What exactly are the officials saying? They want to know if you're serious about starting the program. The woman from the Department of Education says they have fast-track approval processes for innovative training initiatives. She wants to schedule a meeting next week. Rafael and Mel looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and panic. The attention they were receiving was exactly what they needed to launch the school, but it was happening faster than they had prepared for. Tell them we'll be back in Manila this afternoon, Rafael said. And Mrs. Santos? Thank you for taking care of Miguel through all of this. That boy is so proud of his papa. He's been showing everyone his drawings and explaining how deaf mechanics can feel vibrations that hearing people miss. You should see how excited he is about having Miss Mel as part of your family. After the call ended, Mel sat quietly for a moment, processing the implications of what was happening. Rafael, are we really ready for this? Starting a school, dealing with media attention, managing expectations from government officials. I don't know, he admitted, but I know that a week ago, I was working a cargo job. I hated to pay medical bills that were crushing my dreams. And you were stranded in an airport with no idea how to reach your sister. Now we're talking about building something that could change lives. It's terrifying. The best dreams usually are. They spent the morning in careful preparation, reviewing their business plan, organizing their documentation, and planning their approach to the meetings that awaited them in Manila. But underneath the practical discussions, Mel was aware of a deeper transformation taking place. The woman who had boarded that original flight to Singapore had been running away from disappointment, seeking reconciliation with a sister she had lost through pride and stubbornness. The woman, preparing to return to Manila, was running toward possibility, ready to build something new with people who had become family. As they walked to the airport for their final flight together, though neither of them thought of it as final anymore, Mel pulled out Mang Tomas's compass one last time. Still pointing north? Rafael asked. Still pointing home, she replied, which it turns out was never a place I was trying to reach. It was a place I was learning to build. The Cessna sat waiting on the tarmac, its white and blue paint gleaming in the morning sun. In the past week, it had carried them through storms and across islands, had been their classroom and their refuge, had brought them to people who needed help and connected them with others who wanted to help in return. Ready for the next adventure? Rafael asked, as they completed their pre-flight inspection. Mel settled into the left seat, pilot in command position, and placed her hands on the yoke with growing confidence. Over the past week, Rafael had gradually transferred more of the flying responsibilities to her, and this morning she would be the one to navigate them home. Ready, she said, her voice steady with new certainty. Let's go build a school. As the engine came to life and they taxied toward the runway, Mel thought about all the people who were waiting for them in Manila. Miguel, with his drawings and dreams, Mrs. Santos with her engineering expertise, Roberto and Elena with their construction resources, Rosa with her foundation connections, and the families who were already inquiring about flying lessons for their children. The control tower cleared them for takeoff, and as the Cessna lifted into the clear morning sky, Mel felt the same wonder she had experienced on her first flight, but deeper now, seasoned with purpose and strengthened by partnership. Below them, the islands of the Philippines spread out like scattered emeralds, each one holding communities where children might someday learn that the sky was not a barrier, but a pathway to dreams they had never imagined possible. The crowd at Ninoy Aquino's General Aviation Terminal was larger than anything Rafael had expected. As their Cessna taxied toward the parking area, he could see television news crews, education officials in pressed uniforms, and what appeared to be at least 50 people holding signs and banners. "Welcome home, future pilots," read one banner held by a group of children. Another sign, professionally printed, declared, "Innovation in Aviation Education, Philippine Future." "Oh my," Mel breathed, her hands still steady on the controls as she brought the aircraft to a smooth stop. "I think we might have underestimated how much attention our little rescue mission would generate." Through the crowd, Rafael spotted Miguel running toward them, his face bright with excitement, Mrs. Santos following close behind. But there were also strangersmen in business suits with clipboards, women with press badges and cameras, and what looked like an official government delegation complete with security personnel. As they shut down the engine and opened the doors, the noise hit them like a wall. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes popped, and official-looking people pressed forward with documents and business cards. "Mr. Ilagan, is it true you're planning to revolutionize aviation education in the Philippines?" "Miss Santos, how does it feel to go from passenger to pilot to school co-founder in 1 week? When will the Santos Ilagan Aviation Academy open its doors?" Mel looked at Rafael with wide eyes. "Santos Ilagan Aviation Academy? I think we're about to find out what we've gotten ourselves into," he replied. Miguel managed to push through the crowd first, wrapping his arms around his father in a fierce hug before turning to Mel with equal enthusiasm. "Miss Mel, you came back. I knew you would." "Of course I came back," she said, kneeling to his level despite the chaos around them. "We have a school to build, don't we?" Dr. Patricia Santos from the Department of Education stepped forward, her manner professional but warm. "Mr. Ilagan, Miss Santos, I'm Dr. Patricia Santos, no relation, just a happy coincidence of names. We've been following your story with great interest. The heroic rescue aside, your educational methodology and inclusive approach to aviation training align perfectly with our national technical education priorities." She gestured to a folder thick with documents. "We've prepared a fast-track certification package. If you're serious about launching this program, we can have you operational within 60 days. 60 days? Rafael felt slightly overwhelmed. "Dr. Santos, with respect, a week ago this was just a dream. We don't have facilities, equipment, a full curriculum." "Actually," interrupted a distinguished man in an expensive suit, "you might have more resources than you realize. I'm Marcus Chen, Roberto Mendoza's business partner. Roberto asked me to expedite whatever construction and infrastructure you need. We've already identified 3 potential sites for your campus." A woman with a press badge stepped forward. "I'm Maria Delgado from Philippine Daily Inquirer. Our readers are fascinated by your story, the teacher who learned to fly, the pilot who found his calling again, the school that will break down barriers for disadvantaged students. This is exactly the kind of positive news the country needs." The attention was dizzying, but through it all, Mel found herself focusing on Miguel, who was excitedly explaining their journey to anyone who would listen. His sign language was rapid and animated as he described their emergency landing, the village children learning about aircraft instruments, and his drawings of Miss Mel teaching in their future classrooms. "The most important thing," she heard him saying to a reporter, "is that the school will prove that deaf students can do anything. My papa says there's no reason we can't fix airplanes just because we can't hear them." A woman in formal attire approached them with a warm smile. "Excuse me, are you Amelia Santos? I'm Rosa Santos Chen. I believe you're my sister." The crowd noise faded as Mel stared at the woman she hadn't seen in 15 years. Rosa was older, of course, with silver threading through her black hair and laugh lines around her eyes. But her smile was exactly the same, warm, slightly mischievous, and filled with affection. "Rosa," Mel whispered, then louder, "Rosa." The sisters embraced, while cameras flashed around them, but for a moment the chaos disappeared entirely. 15 years of separation, pride and misunderstanding dissolved in the space of a single hug. "I got the first flight I could," Rosa said, laughing through tears. "I couldn't miss seeing my sister become a pilot and a school founder in the same week." "I'm so sorry," Mel began, but Rosa shook her head. "No apologies. We're here now, and we have work to do." I've been talking to the Foundation Board, and we're prepared to commit initial funding for your aviation program. But more than that, she gestured toward the crowd of officials, reporters, and supporters. I think you've tapped into something the whole country has been waiting for. As the sisters talked, Rafael found himself holding the official school charter documents that Dr. Santos had pressed into his hands. The papers were real incorporation documents, educational licenses, even a preliminary accreditation certificate that would allow them to begin operations immediately. It's happening, he said to Miguel, who was studying the documents with obvious pride. Our school is really happening, Miguel confirmed, his hands moving in excited sign language before he remembered to speak aloud. Miss Mel is really going to be our teacher, and Tita Rosa is going to help us build everything we dreamed about. Looking around at the organized chaos of supporters, officials, media, and family, Rafael realized that somewhere in the space of a week, their impossible dream had become an inevitable reality. 3 weeks later, Mel stood at the edge of the newly constructed runway at their aviation academy, her hands trembling slightly as she held her pilot's license, the official certificate that declared her qualified to operate aircraft as pilot in command. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete, and in the distance she could see the framework of their first hangar rising against the sky. "Ready for your first official solo flight as a licensed pilot?" Rafael asked, approaching with Miguel and Rosa, who had extended her stay indefinitely to help establish the school's academic programs. "Nervous," Mel admitted. "Flying with you felt natural. Flying alone feels like a completely different responsibility." The Cessna sat waiting on the tarmac, freshly painted with the school's logo, a stylized eagle with its wings spread over the islands of the Philippines, and the words, "Santos, Ilagan Aviation Academy, where dreams take flight," painted along the fuselage. Over the past 3 weeks, their lives had transformed with startling speed. The media attention had attracted not just students and funding, but a network of supporters they never could have imagined. Retired pilots volunteered as instructors, aircraft manufacturers donated training equipment, and families from across the archipelago inquired about enrollment for their children. The most meaningful development had been the response from the deaf community. Word had spread through social networks and advocacy groups about an aviation school specifically designed to include deaf students, and applications had poured in from young people who had never imagined careers in aviation were possible for them. "Miguel's been practicing his teaching skills," Rosa said, watching as the boy demonstrated aircraft controls to a group of visiting students. "He's going to be an excellent instructor someday." "He's going to be whatever he wants to be," Mel replied. "That's the whole point of what we're building here." The first official class would begin next month with 20 students, 12 hearing, 8 deaf, ranging in age from 16 to 25. They had developed a curriculum that combined traditional aviation training with innovative teaching methods designed for inclusive learning. Visual instruction techniques, hands-on mechanical work, and collaborative problem-solving would ensure that every student could succeed regardless of their hearing status. But today was about something more personal. Mel's first solo flight as a licensed pilot would take her on a route that retraced their original journey, a symbolic completion of the transformation that had begun with a stranded passenger in an airport terminal. "Dr. Santos called this morning," Rafael said, referring to the Department of Education official who had become their primary government liaison. "The president wants to visit next month for the official opening ceremony. This program has become a national model for inclusive technical education." "No pressure there," Mel said with a nervous laugh. "You know what I think?" Rosa said, linking arms with her sister. "I think you've already proven everything you need to prove. You took a crazy idea from a stranger in an airport and turned it into something that's going to change lives for generations." "We took a crazy idea," Mel corrected. "This only worked because we found each other." She looked around at the bustling campus that had emerged from empty land in just 3 weeks. Students were already arriving for orientation sessions, their families exploring the facilities with obvious pride. The first dormitory was nearly complete. designed specifically to accommodate both hearing and deaf students with visual alert systems and collaborative learning spaces. "Remember when you asked me what my north was?" she said to Rafael, pulling out Mang Tomas's compass, which she had carried with her every day since leaving Panglao Island. "When you decided not to go to Singapore." "Look." She held up the compass, its brass surface gleaming in the morning light. "It's pointing right here, to this runway, this school, this moment." Rafael studied the instrument, then looked up at her with a smile that carried the weight of everything they had built together. Maybe it was always pointing here. Maybe we just had to learn how to read it properly. Miguel ran over to them, his face bright with excitement. "Miss Mel, the students want to watch your solo flight. Can they, please?" Around the edge of the runway, she could see the gathering crowd, their first class of students, visiting families, school staff, and even some of the village children from Panglao, who had traveled with their parents to see the official opening of their sky school. "I suppose there's no backing out now," she said, accepting the keys to the Cessna from Rafael. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked, the flight instructor in him needing final confirmation. Mel thought about the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, she couldn't have imagined herself as a pilot, much less as the co-founder of an aviation academy. But as she looked at Miguel's expectant face, at Rosa's proud smile, at the students who were already seeing possibilities they had never considered before, she realized that readiness wasn't about feeling completely prepared. It was about trusting that you had learned enough to handle whatever came next. "I'm ready," she said. The pre-flight inspection took on special significance with her audience watching. She checked control surfaces, tested instruments, and verified fuel levels with the careful precision Rafael had taught her, but also with the confidence that came from weeks of practice and study. As she climbed into the pilot's seat and began her engine start checklist, she caught sight of Roberto and Elena Mendoza in the crowd, the couple whose medical emergency had crystallized her decision to stay in the Philippines. They had become regular supporters of the school, with Roberto's construction company donating labor for much of the facility development. Santos, Ilagan traffic, Cessna, 4,728R, ready for departure, runway 9, she announced on the radio, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Cessna 28R, cleared for takeoff. "Have a beautiful flight, Miss Mel," came the response from Miguel, who was manning their small control tower as part of his advanced training. The takeoff was smooth and confident. As the runway fell away beneath her, Mel felt the familiar sensation of the earth dropping away, but this time it was accompanied by something newer, sense of complete belonging in the cockpit, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She circled the campus once at Patton altitude, looking down at the people who had gathered to watch her flight. From 10 feet, she could see the entire scope of what they had built, classrooms, hangars, dormitories, and the beginnings of additional runways that would accommodate larger training aircraft as the program expanded. But more than the physical infrastructure, she could see the community they had created. Students were pointing up at her airplane, some of them probably dreaming about their own first solo flights. Families were exploring the campus, imagining futures for their children that hadn't existed before. Staff members were already preparing for the next phase of development. As she turned toward her planned routier flight that would take her over the islands where their journey had unfolded, Mel thought about the teacher she had been just a month ago. That woman had been competent, caring, and dedicated, but she had also been limited by her own assumptions about what was possible. The woman flying this airplane was still a teacher, but she was also a pilot, a school administrator, a sister reconciled, and a partner in dreams that were already changing lives. The radio crackled with Miguel's voice. "Cessna 28R, you're cleared to pursue your dreams. We'll be here when you get back." Mel smiled as she adjusted her course toward the horizon, the compass on her instrument panel pointing steadily toward a destination she was no longer trying to reach, but was already living every day. 6 months later, the Santos Ilagan Aviation Academy graduation ceremony took place on a perfect Saturday morning, with clear skies and gentle winds that seemed designed for flying. Rosa stood beside Mel at the podium, both sisters watching as their first class of 20 students received their certificates in aircraft maintenance and private pilot ground school completion. The photograph that would later appear in newspapers across Southeast Asia captured a moment of pure joy. Miguel Santos Ilagan, now 11 years old and the youngest assistant instructor in the school's history, presenting a certificate to Amelia Santos, no relation, a deaf 18-year-old who had just completed her aircraft engine specialist training with the highest scores in the class. 6 months ago, Mel addressed the crowd of graduates, families, and dignitaries. I was a stranded passenger who had never been in an airplane smaller than a commercial jetliner. Today, I'm watching students who were told they couldn't work on aircraft because of their hearing prove that determination and proper training can overcome any perceived limitation. In the audience, Rafael beamed with pride as he watched Miguel translate Mel's speech into sign language for the deaf students and their families. The boy had become fluent in both English and Filipino sign language, serving as a bridge between hearing and deaf students while pursuing his own studies in aeronautical engineering. The most important thing we've learned, Mel continued, is that education works best when it builds bridges instead of barriers. When we create opportunities for students to learn from each other's different perspectives and abilities, everyone benefits. The graduation was being broadcast live across the Philippines, part of a documentary series about innovative education programs. But for Mel, the most meaningful part wasn't the media attention or the government recognition. It was watching families see their children achieve goals they had never imagined possible. After the ceremony, Rosa pulled out a professional camera to document the celebration. She had officially relocated to the Philippines 2 months earlier, establishing the Southeast Asian headquarters of her education foundation on the academy campus. "Remember when you used to take pictures at school events?" she asked Mel, adjusting her lens to capture a group of students showing their families around the aircraft maintenance facility. "I was always the teacher in the background, documenting other people's achievements," Mel replied. "Now I feel like I'm part of the story instead of just recording it." The afternoon celebration continued with demonstration flights, equipment displays, and presentations by students about their career plans. Several major airlines had already contacted the academy about preferred hiring arrangements for graduates, and aircraft maintenance companies across Southeast Asia were requesting information about the program's inclusive training methods. But the most touching moment came when Roberto and Elena Mendoza arrived with unexpected guests, their son Carlos, a commercial airline pilot, and his daughter Ana, who was starting high school in the fall. "Ana wants to apply for next year's program," Elena explained to Mel and Rafael. "She says if her grandfather can trust you to save his life, she can trust you to teach her to fly." "Actually," Carlos added, "I've been thinking about volunteering as a flight instructor. What you've built here, this combination of technical excellence and social mission, it's exactly what aviation education should be." As the day wound down, the core family gathered in Rafael's small office above the main hangar: Mel, Rafael, Miguel, Rosa, and Mrs. Santos, who had become the academy's chief academic coordinator. The walls were covered with photos from their journey: the emergency landing in Panglao, the village children learning about aircraft instruments, their first meeting with government officials, and dozens of pictures from the academy's rapid construction and development. "I have something for you," Miguel said to Mel, pulling out a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a beautifully bound book titled The Teacher Who Learned to Fly, a memoir with Mel's name on the cover. "Miguel," she said, touched by the gesture, "I haven't written a memoir." "Not yet," he said with a grin. "But Rosa says you should. She says people need to know that it's never too late to discover what you're really meant to do." Rafael opened his own gifter-framed photograph that Rosa had taken during their first week of operation. It showed Mel and Rafael standing in front of their Cessna with Miguel between them, all three of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. Behind them, students were working on aircraft engines, while others practiced instrument approaches in the flight simulator. "Look what you built," Rosa said softly. "Not just the school, but this family, this community, this proof that impossible dreams can become inevitable realities." As evening approached, Mel found herself walking alone around the campus, taking in the quiet after the day's celebrations. Students were in the dormitories, sharing stories about their graduation and making plans for their continued education. Staff members were already preparing for the next class, which would be twice as large and would include students from 6 different countries. She stopped at the memorial garden they had created near the main entrancia, peaceful space, dedicated to Amelia Ilagan and other aviation pioneers who had paved the way for inclusive education. Elena's portrait smiled from a bronze plaque, and beside it, students had planted flowers from their home provinces, creating a living symbol of the diversity the school celebrated. "Thank you," Mel said quietly to the photograph, "for giving Rafael the vision and for showing him that some dreams are worth the risk." As she turned to walk back toward the residential area where she now lived in a small apartment next to Rosa's, she saw Rafael approaching with 2 cups of coffee and Mang Tomas's compass, which had become a permanent fixture in the school's main office. "Still pointing north?" he asked, settling beside her on the garden bench. "Still pointing home," she replied, accepting the coffee with gratitude. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the campus settled into evening quiet. In the distance, they could hear Miguel practicing piano in the community center, his music drifting across the grounds like a benediction. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my plane hadn't been delayed that night?" Mel asked. "Every day," Rafael admitted. "But then I remember that Elena used to say the best things in life happen when you're brave enough to change direction mid-flight." Above them, a commercial airliner passed overhead, its navigation lights blinking steadily as it carried passengers toward destinations they had planned and dreamed about. But Mel no longer felt the urge to be on that plane, rushing toward some distant goal. She was exactly where she belonged, building something that would outlast any single journey, surrounded by family she had chosen and dreams that had chosen her in return.